All right, you're live.
Welcome everyone to our November 17th Global Education Colloquium. I want to welcome everyone who's in the room live with us, as well as those of you who are joining us via the live streamed YouTube channel as well. After this talk, we will make this available sometime in the future on the Global Education Colloquium event website. So today, my name is Christy Kelly, and I am a faculty member here in the School of Education at Drexel University, and we're super excited to have Dr. Hyunjun Park from the University of Pennsylvania School of Sociology, or Department of Sociology. He is going to be talking to us about his recent research and a book that has just come out on rethinking Japanese and Korean education. The book is called Reevaluating Education in Japan and Korea, Demystifying Stereotypes, and it came out with Routledge in 2013. Dr. Park is a Korean Foundation Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. He is interested in educational stratification and family and cross-national comparative perspective, focusing particularly on East Asia and most notably in Korea and Japan. He's investigated how school and family effects on children's education are contingent upon institutional arrangements of educational systems, public policy, and demographic changes. Dr. Park has published more than 50 journal articles and book chapters. In addition to the book on Japan and Korea with Routledge, he also has an edited volume with Kyung Kun Kim, I apologize for if I've mispronounced the name, on Korean education in changing economic and demographic context that came out with Springer in 2014. So a big welcome to Dr. Park, and we will save question and answers for the end of the presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for such great introductions. So today I'm going to talk about the Japanese and Korean education, particularly about how their kids are performed as compared to other countries. I'm sure that you have lots of image about what the Japanese and Korean education looks like, right? If you think about Japanese and Korean students, that kind of image that you have now. And I'm trying to really kind of challenge whether that kind of stereotypes, or, no, I will not say stereotype, that's some of them actually are true, but whether that kind of images are comprehensive or actually somehow correct in terms of the point that I'm going to actually make. Because I think the reasons of what I actually spend much time to think about, kind of rethink Japanese Korean education, is because I think we have lots of information about Japanese and Korean education, but sometimes we don't really see what's their real strengths and weaknesses of the educational system. Instead of probably just we look at very simple facts about how their kids are doing, but we don't necessarily ask about why and what actually makes some kids doing better than other the countries, especially for Japanese and Korean education. So let me start with some statistics about how Japanese Korean. This is actually the statistics showing the percentage of population that has obtained a tertiary education, so like a 2-year junior college and 4-year college as well, by the age group. So if you actually look at this younger group, which is 25 to 34 in 2006, Korea and Japan are actually most highly educated population probably in the whole world. As you can see, among these young people, actually majority, more than 50% of them actually have tertiary education, right? If you actually look at the where's the U.S.? Right here, right? So I think among these young people, Japanese and Korean, again, the young people have probably the highest level of education in comparative perspective. But if you actually look at the old cohort, who are the 55 to 64 in that year, as you can see that that's one of the lowest country. Similar to Mexico, Austria, even actually lower than Austria, and Chile, and Portugal. And those are the countries that were very similar in one generation before this young old generation, right? So this is actually one of the countries showing the largest actually, the change between two generations, basically. In other words, among you, actually only one of you, one of 10, that had parents who actually, probably took tertiary education. But now, actually more than 5 and 6, almost 6 of you actually have tertiary education in one generation. So it means actually a lot in terms of think about the social change associated with this educational change, in terms of attitude, in terms of behavior, in terms of some all other things associated with educational development. And you can see this is a country that actually shows the largest difference between old and younger generation. Japan also actually showed that actually pretty high, the large actually difference between younger and old generation. If you look at some other country, yes, they start actually low, but actually they increase, but that not even comparable as that much, the variations and increase in educational attainment between two generations. So this is where the country you can think about what really means educational development. That's where you can see that, how those factors, this whole society change, right? At the, associated with educational development. But this is a quantitative increase in education, but what about the qualitative, the quality of the Korean and Japanese education? In the field of education, as you know well, that there's several international survey of tests. So in other words, it's called the TEAMS particularly, and the PISA, they actually survey students across many countries, and they measure how students perform in major subjects such as math and science, and they compare across country. If you look at the 1995 TEAMS results, Korea was number 1 and Japan was number 2 in science among 26 countries. In math, there was 2nd and 3rd. If you actually look at another survey which is done in 2000 PISA, again among the 15-year-old, Korea was number 1 and Japan was number 2 in science, and again 2 and 3rd in math. So regardless of the grade, subject, and probably years, always number 1, 2, 3rd, 4th. If they're not the number 1, number 2, then which country will be the number 1?
Shanghai.
Yeah, maybe it's Shanghai, maybe it's Singapore, right? Finland, yes, that's a lonely country. Yeah, Finland, right? But again, I think this is also tell us how the quality of education is actually extremely good in these two countries, as well as a quantitative increase in education. So that's how we actually start this conversation. So because of these actually outstanding records in both quantitative and qualitative educations, lots of education policymakers in the world actually start to pay more attention to Korean education recently. In 1980, it was like a Japanese education. That U.S. media all focus on Japanese, why they're doing well, how we can actually kind of come up with a similar system as Japanese education. But actually, Obama administration often talked about actually Korean education. Especially if you actually, as one of the examples was actually 2014, actually, the Education Secretary Annette Duncan actually would really applaud how Korea actually did well and say, why can't we be more like South Korea? Why can't we be more South Korea? Yeah? So that was kind of the positive side of scholars and policymakers try to become more interested about knowing about why the Korean kids are doing well, as you just saw in the several records. But on the other hand, there's a long-standing criticism on Japanese and Korean education too, as well as this this positive response and positive the favoring perspective on Korean education. And actually, President Obama made a very good speech about Korean education. But the next day, what happened in South Korea? There actually some of newspaper made actually editorial say Obama doesn't know anything about Korean education. We are not that good. So that's what their actual response. So for instance, Korea Times, the next day, as President Obama made a speech about Korean education, they say Obama's remark came as a surprise to many South Koreans, as the country education system has been under constant public criticism due to its lack of creativity and heavy dependence on private tutoring. So I think this is a very typical kind of criticism of Japanese Korean education, right? Yes, Korean and Japanese kids are doing well, so good in tests, but they actually they're not creative. And the reason why they're doing on the international tests, because they all engage in private tutoring. So these are I think the very typical criticism of Japanese and Korean education, but this criticism also came from their own side, not from outside. So actually lots of Koreans believe themselves this is a problem with Korean education. Yes, we are so much pay attention to how kids are doing on tests, but we are not equipped to actually enhance the students' creativity. And also students are so much involved, parents are so much involved in private tutoring. So those are two actually kind of very typical criticism on Japanese and Korean education, right? I mean, this is probably, you also probably have a lot about this kind of criticism as well. And this is a typical actual picture. If you actually Google the New York Times, you see lots of these kind of pictures about the private tutoring in South Korea and Japan. Look at this. I mean, look at these guys. I mean, he's sleeping. And this is, I think, this is one of the actual cram school, but sleeping, and they spend tons of times in their to prepare the college exam, and they say even taste of failure fools and aptitude for success in South Korea's cram school. So this is another very typical criticism on Japanese Korean education, again focusing on this high involvement of students on private tutoring. Sometimes it even kills the students, the health, mental health, and all other problems, as well as the economic burden of family to pay for this cram school, right? So those are the kind of, again, the very typical criticisms. Then it's not only from the inside of Korea and Japan, but also actually scholars in the United States sometimes do the same criticism on Japanese and Korean education. And this is the good actual example how some of the American scholars actually see the Korean and Japanese education. So this is from the past, actually, the scholar, recently, he raved of South Korea. So he hears actually President Obama rave South Korean school, but neglect to say that thousands of South Korean families sell their children. They sell to American family. I don't think this is true. They don't sell their kids to American family particularly, right? But they say, so to learn English and avoid the horrific wages of Korean school. You start to see that one of the very typical criticism is very, the rigid system of Korean and Japanese education system. Then another important point about how they criticize Korean and Japanese education is while U.S. trails Korea on average test score, it has a higher proportion of students scoring at the highest level on the PISA. So what they're making point here is that yes, Korean kids are doing on average, but American education is much better on the top. We have Bill Gates, and right, that kind of people who really lead the economy with the creative and with the very, high skill, they're actually at the top. But in other words, American education is not doing well if you really look at the average score because we have lots of different population, first of all. But perhaps Japanese and Korean, the populations are more homogeneous in terms of culture. But we are good at the top of the distribution. That's another point that sometimes the American scholars make to criticize Japanese and Korean education. But in fact, if you really look at, I will show that that's not true though. American education doesn't do well at the top either. But we think, and they think, the American education may not be, again, doing well on the average student's level, but we have a good and top, the students and leaders of this world economy, right? That kind of image that we have here. So that it has the highest number of high score of any country. No one else even come close. Again, this is not all true. If you really look at the data, it doesn't tell us like that. So I will actually show. So that's kind of the point that I like to. So here actually to make the final point is the top performing students, not the average one, who are going to lead the way in innovation. So American education should not be blamed because we have lower average score, which may be true, but it's not really true though if you really make an argument that American education is fine because we are doing well on the top, because that's not true either. So that's kind of my point, that we actually never really see what's going on from my perspective. We always see what we want to see from this kind of international business of international test score. Always people try to get the information from one side without really looking at this large actual picture. So that's today, I want to actually tackle a couple of things, of the many things that I actually wanted to say. So let me summarize here the three typical criticisms on Japanese and Korean education. I did not mean here that there's these are only actually criticism, but I think this is probably typical criticism that you may see a lot from these news media and scholarly work. So highly standardized and uniform education in Japan and Korea make talent students mediocre, right? Again, this is the argument that Korean and Japanese educations are good on the average, but they are not actually good at educating at the top. And obviously, Japan has lots of Nobel Prize, receivers, right? But not for Korea. So sometimes make that kind of things. But again, I think this is the criticism. And second criticism is about Japanese and Korean education system put too much emphasis on academic test score at the expense of creativity and independent thinking. Again, yes, Japanese and Korean kids show the high scores in international test score, but they're not as creative as American kids or other kids. And they don't have good skill for independent thinking. Third criticism is about the private tutoring. So the high success of Japanese and Korean students in the international test score is primarily due to high prevalence of private supplementary education. Not particularly because their public schools are doing good jobs to educate kids. Again, they criticize that, yes, Japanese and Korean kids probably show the highest test score in the international test score, but not because their public schools are doing good job to educate kids, but because many of them involved in this private tutoring. So if actually they are doing well, that's because the private tutoring, not because of the public education in Japanese and Korean education. So those are, I think, the very typical criticism of Japanese and Korean education. And some of them are true if you really look at, but my point today I like to make is some of them are not like a really compensate to some extent, because sometimes we actually don't see another important part because of this kind of stereotypes on Japanese and Korean education. And another, probably the typical image on Japanese Korean education, if I can say, is that probably many people think Japanese Korean educations are very similar. And today, in fact, I'm actually going to say more likely to be the similar between Japanese and Korean education. So I will not try to make a distinction between Japanese and Korean education and most of the time. But in fact, there's a good, important difference between Japanese and Korean education system. But we, again, in America, we tend to ignore such a difference between the Japanese and Korean education. So, but that's another, I think, probably the stereotype that I can think of when we, talk about Japanese and Korean education. So my thesis from the, I want to actually put front so that actually you can see where I'm actually going from here, is that both favorable critical view on Japanese Korean education do not really look into the structural feature of Japanese and Korean education to understand and to explain their students' performance. In other words, what actually makes Japanese Korean education structural feature of the education system, what like an important feature of those systems, and how does that actually relate to students' performance. Then both favorable and critical view on Japanese Korean education rarely appreciate the distinctive pattern of the distribution of student performance with heavy focus on average score. When we only look at the average score and ranking, we get some image. But when we actually look at the distribution, I will show you in a moment that you will actually get quite different view on Japanese and Korean education. So my point here is that we have to look at the distribution rather than average and ranking. Then we have to really understand the structural feature of Japanese and Korean education to understand why they show such a pattern. So in today's talk, I will actually briefly describe the structural feature of Japanese Korean education that might have affected students' academic performance. So probably many structural features, I would like to just focus on one thing today and think about how that actually may affect how students doing in tests. Then I'll actually show some of the findings from PISA data focusing on the distribution of student performance. And so hopefully, this kind of the presentation can challenge some of the stereotype criticism of Japanese and Korean education. So again, I can't actually talk details about all these criticisms, but so I will actually bring some of the main and simple the finding from PISA data, so that we can think about whether that actually can tell us something about this stereotype criticism of Japanese and Korean education. But before I'd like to share my finding, let me briefly talk about what the actual Korean and Japanese education looks like. Okay, so I call it traditional because now after 2000, Korean and Japanese education went through the very significant educational reforms. So now the education system in Japan and Korea really look different as compared to the before early or before 2000. Again, that's another stereotype we always keep. We don't understand that some things change. We always stick with some old image of Japanese Korean education. If you go to Korea now, Japan, whole schools look so much different from what you actually know about already. So that's why I call it traditional, because they already move away from that system. So now if I go to Korea, now the system is so much different from what I'm actually going to talk today. So I'm sticking with the old image of traditional Korean Japanese education because I will actually share at the last minute that how the shifting in this education reform actually changed the different outcome in Japanese and Korean education. So let me start with what actually looks like traditional Japanese and Korean education looks like. Obviously, high degree of education standardization and centralization, so that there's a strong control and guidance by the central government. The Ministry of Education in both countries has very tight control and guidance about the education system. So sometimes they even have uniform curriculums, and even pace of instruction was well, described in advance by the government, and obviously nationwide college entrance exam. I'm talking about Japanese and Korean education, but this probably look very similar to some of you who study other Asian countries, like the Chinese education system, perhaps Taiwan, a little bit Hong Kong. I think it probably, right? You can actually probably see the very similar feature of education system. So I think even though I'm actually focused on Japan and Korea, but I think it may have large implications beyond these two particular countries. And homogeneous schooling experience. In the United States, for instance, and my kids are actually going to middle school, and even middle school and particularly in high school, you are going to segregate into different actually classroom even within the same school. Depends on your ability, right? And performance. For instance, math class, you go to calculus, sometimes you go to like a general math, right? You go to different class, depends on your interest, depends on your ability. So even if we go to the same school, in fact, within school, we are exposed to different experience. That's called ability, like a within school tracking system, right? But in South Korea and Japan, all day, there's very homogeneous schooling. There was no much ability grouping or within school trackings. So that actually kids were exposed to very standardized curriculums across, the whole school. And in the United States, if you're not doing particular year, sometimes you're recommended to actually stay one more year, right? It's called the Great Retention. The reason why some people actually recommend Great Retention because they think the kids can catch up by spending one more year, right? So that you actually repeat the same curriculums and you repeat 1 year so that next year you're ready to move on. It's called the Great Retention. But in South Korea and Japan, there's no such a Great Retention. Every kid just move to the next year regardless of how your guys are doing. Unless there's a big issue about the health issue and other issue. Sociology actually found a great retention despite the idea that it will actually have time for kids to catch up. But actually it turns out that this doesn't actually work that way. Sometimes great retention is an increase in quality. So increase the gap. So the kids cannot catch up, in fact, because of some other reasons. Many reasons, psychological reasons and some other reasons. But in South Korea, again, just because of no great retention, kids and the kids get very homogeneous schooling experience within school. Again, the same curriculums, no ability grouping, and you can move on to the next level regardless of how you guys are doing. But I think it's the most extreme probably example of standardized and homogeneous schooling experience is about the high school equalization policy. This is particularly for Korea, not for Japan. So this is where Japanese and Korean educations are really distinctive in that sense. This is the essence of standard Korean education. What does it do is actually middle school graduates randomly assigned to school within school district, regardless of whether schools are private and public. Even actually regardless of whether schools are single-sex school and co-ed school. South Korea has lots of single-sex school, all boys and all girls school as compared to co-ed school, but that's also randomly assigned. So I was randomly assigned to all boys school, not particularly because I like it, but because of this lottery actually assigned me to this all boys school. Again, this is just no school choice. Although you can actually move to another school district, but you are subject to another lottery in that particular, the school district. So in fact, from students' perspective, it's hard to choose any school that you want to go. So no school choice by parents and students, and no school choice by school. Even if a private school, you have to receive students that are assigned by the lottery. So to extreme sense, the private school in South Korea probably not a private school that you know. It's just a matter of the owner of the schools are not government, so it's probably the private agency that actually who own the school. Yes.
So you're saying that there are randomly assigned within
school district,
right? But is there a variation between the districts?
No, that's true. I mean, that's true. So that obviously some school district probably wealthier than others, and also some school quality, but. Compared to other countries though, and within one school district, for instance, South Korea, at the high school level, there's lots of high school within school district. So within school district, you don't know where you were assigned to the bank. But you're right. I mean, there's some difference across the school district. And also, this policy is not applied to everywhere in South Korea, but it actually has, for instance, Seoul, which is capital of South Korea, used to actually keep the policy for a long time.
Do the private schools charge tuition?
So in fact, that's because if you to make the tuition too high, then you're probably not happy if you're assigned to, right? Like especially the working class family. So in order to prevent that, actually Korean governments actually subsidize some of this tuition. So from students' perspective, the money that you pay to schools are pretty much the same. So there's not much difference between the tuition. That means the school quality also not much different. Right? Because again, this is a centralized system, so the Korean government actually distributes the school resources across the school. The only difference between private and public school in South Korea is about the teacher rotation. So I will actually show in a moment, because this random assignments is not only students' assignment, but the teacher also have to be rotated every 5 years, public school teacher. So even if you like to stay in one school for 5 years, you can. You have to go to another school. And that was pretty much, the design to prevent these high-quality teachers staying in one particular school for many, many years. So that actually students can get exposed to this high-quality teacher even if you live in a poor neighborhood, for instance. So in other words, this high school equalization policy working at the students level, at the actually teachers level. But private school teachers don't have to be located because they're hired by each school so that they can stay for longer if you actually want to. So that's kind of important difference between private and public school in South Korean context in terms of teachers, the recruitment and the hiring process. But at the students level, it's pretty much the same. So this policy was implemented since 1974, and this random assignment helped to reduce between school difference in quality and resource, in fact. Before this policy was implemented, Korean middle school graduates could apply to high school so that they were, took the individual school level test. So that there was a rank of the school. In fact, we knew that what's the number 1 school in South Korea and what's the number 10 in 1,000 in a high school. But because of this growing concern about the between school difference in qualities and students level, so the Korean government decided to get rid of this ranking system and randomly assign to school. And Japan still kept this in a ranking system. So that's kind of a big difference between Korea and Japan. But then you can see that the student perspective, you didn't get much difference in terms of within schooling experience, right? The same curriculums again, and you move to the next grade, with all your friends. But even between school difference is much smaller than probably many other countries because you can't choose a school, and you are assigned by random, by random lottery. So this is how this education system works in that particular country. So what will be the consequence for that? So that's what my first question is about. Without really understanding this structural feature of education system, we can't understand why some students in South Korea show certain pattern than others. So, for instance, this is a good example of how Korean education, because of this standardization system, how it actually look different from other countries. So this is from Akiba and Thunders and Scribe-Nonner's paper, which shows how unequal the kids from low SES and high SS families are access to the qualified teacher. So it's hard to actually read numbers, but The large number means that there's a large gap between high and low SS kids, socioeconomic status, in terms of their access to high qualified teacher. If number minus means that actually low SS kids get higher possibility to get highly qualified teacher.
What does qualified teacher mean in this?
You know what? I don't remember exactly, but they have some measure about the years and PhD, right? So they actually create this index about what that means, but I don't quite remember what that exactly. But so United States over here. So it means that in the United States there's a large gap between high and low SS kids in terms of access to high qualified teacher. In other words, in the United States, you have to live in the right place to get this high qualified teacher, right? And this country, Singapore, Hong Kong, among the East Asian countries, also that kind of large gap between affluent kids and poor kids in terms of their access to high qualified teacher. But if we actually look at Korea, actually it shows this negative value. It means that actually low SS kids are more likely access to high qualified teacher. I'm sure that probably some of them are explained by this, the teaching location. I mean, Japan is like a kind of borders, right, in the middle. But still, if you really compare it to U.S., you can see that pretty much just the middle of the rank and actually in the left side. So what does that mean? Actually, in South Korea, particularly, these low SS kids, even if they're coming from the poor family background, they have a higher chance to get access to actually high qualified teacher. And also probably in terms of resource, sometimes the Korean government try to distribute these school resources actually more to those poor neighborhood school rather than the affluent neighborhood school. So I think these kind of systems, especially standardized education system, work to some extent to help these low actually achieving and low SS kids probably more than their counterpart. So that's kind of the general background of structure feature. So then, how these structure features may be related to student performance in the PISA data. So that to answer that question, I use the PISA data, which is coming from OECD, the international survey of students' achievement in 40 to 50 countries. Now probably it's more than that even. So they start 2000 every 3 years. So now even they have data 2009 and 2012. In the book, at the time, I didn't have that data, so I couldn't actually include them. So, in my book, actually, I started in 2006. This survey is a survey of 15-year-old school, the kids in school. So if you're not in school in 15 years old, at 15-year-old, then you're not included in the survey. So if in some of the developing country where lots of students are not school at age 15, then this survey becomes a little bit issue about the selection. But in South Korea and Japan and US, 15-year-old kids, most of them are in school. So we don't actually have any, the issue. And it includes every type of school. So it doesn't actually quite matter in that sense. And cross-nationally and temporally comparable measure of educational achievement in math, science, and reading. So 15-year-old kids, how they're doing in math, science, and reading across many countries. And Shanghai actually joined, I think it was 2009 or something, joined, and they showed highest performance, which everyone was shocked. It was too high, given what the other countries do. So I said there's a lot of speculation about how Shanghai schools can do such a great job. Lots of people have a different theory, but that's kind of the situation that really surprised many the scholars how they really did well in PISA. But in my data, I didn't actually have because they didn't participate in all PISA. So my first question: do Japanese Korean schools really make talented students mediocre? So the question. We can think about many different ways to answer that question. But I found that one simple way of looking at this data, and this is what I actually find out. So this is called cumulative distribution of students. In other words, I actually ordered the students from the bottom to the top in each country, and they plot here. So 50% means the kind of in the middle of the the distributions. Students, if you are the middle of the country in the U.S., which is a green line, then you scored about 450. That's how you read. Okay. So if you are the midpoint in the Korean, Japan, then you actually score 520 something. Does it make sense? If you are top 10% in Japan, in US, then you, which is 90 percentile, right? You scored about 550 something. I don't exactly remember, right? Then if you're the top 10%, which is 90 percentile, then you score about a 610 something, right? That's how you read this graph. Are you with me?
Yeah.
What do you see? What's the interesting pattern here? Let's first take a look at the top kids, okay? That's what their argument's about, right? Who are doing better, actually? Top 90%, top 10%, 90 percentile, Japanese and Korean kids are doing better than US and German kids. This is a science. Everyone talking about, the Bill Gates. See, okay, bring on science. I mean, but it's not true. I mean, maybe 99 percentile, I don't know. I don't care, to be honest, 1 percentile. I mean, that's a whole lot different issue. But at least 90 percentile, you can see that that's not quite true. I mean, they're probably, if not they doing well, but then doing as good as, right? As well as, actually, as in the US and German kid. But I think the most interesting point of this graph is not the top, but it's actually bottom. Why Japanese and Korean kids do well on average? Not because their top kids are doing well, but because their bottom kids are doing well. If you really look at the 20 percentile, for instance, like really kids who are struggling probably, this is the red line is actually Finland, Japan, and South Korea, right? The gap is almost 100 points. This is a huge gap, right? In other words, the reason why Japanese and Koreans' average scores are actually higher than American and German education is particularly because these middle and low performing students are really doing better than their counterpart. And as you can see, the gap is small here and increased up here, then even actually become largest in the bottom. So why do Japanese and Korean kids do well? Because their bottom kids are doing well. Right? And Finland showed very similar patterns. So Finland is another kind of really the big country in PISA, right? It's one of the probably favorable countries in PISA. And they showed very similar pattern that their bottoms are so strong than actually their counterpart. Where did that come from? Well, I think I have lots of theory about where do they come from. But as I showed the structure feature of education system, whereas these lots of low SS kids get higher chance of getting a higher qualified teacher, right? And also there's no between school tracking, the choice, strong choice, and within school you get exposed to the very similar, the curriculum. So I think that'll probably help these low achieving kids and low essay kids to maintain certain level of literacy skill as compared to other countries where it's not so much research or focus on those kind of, the bottom of, the distribution. So again, I'm not actually making here any cultural influence, whether they might be explained by some other factor, but I do see though that might, likely, plausibly actually explain some of these, the reasons why these bottom kids in Japan and Korea is stronger than compared to the US and German actually system. This is a math, exactly the same point, right? That was actually the science, and this is a math. As you can see, this even math, yes, at the top, probably Japanese and Korean kids are doing better than actually US top kids, but the more important is actually the larger gap at the bottom. Exactly the same pattern. So I actually look at them by actually poor students and affluent students. So I define by rank of every the students in 4 countries here, then rank them and actually I make bottom 25% as poor students and top as affluent students. As you can see that this is the average score of the 4 countries. So this is the poor students. And you can see the gap is actually much larger among these poor students across the country, right? Japanese poor students is 526, which is higher than average score of the United States. And Korean kids 508, and the US kids is 449. So the gap is much larger even than the average score. If you actually look at the top, again, Japanese and Korean kids do better actually, even though small scale, right? So there's no reasons why we actually have to say that Japanese Korean kids not doing at the top. In fact, they probably do as good as the U.S. kids or German kids. But the point is that the gap is much larger among the poor students. The reason why U.S. education is not doing well is not particularly because these top kids are not doing well as compared to other kids. Yeah, they're not doing little, but it's fine, right? But in fact, more difference, more, the weight actually among the poor students. So American education does relatively poor job to educating these poor students as compared to Japanese and Korean education. So did I answer the first question? I think so, to some extent. So no, Japanese Korean top performers on the regime of a highly standardized education system did as well as, or even better than top performers in Finland, Germany, and the United States. And Japanese Korean schools in the highly standardized system produce strong performers, not only at the higher, but actually particularly at the lower end of the score distribution. So I think this is one way that I address this issue. What about the second question? Do Japanese and Korean students achieve high academic test score at the expense of creativity and independent thinking? I think this is a top question, in fact, because I think it is tough because what is creativity? That's lots of subject to the debate. I think the creativity is actually subject to this cultural interpretation, right? Maybe it depends on culture. People think about creativity in a different way. Do you have any previous work to measure creativity across culture? I've never actually seen any empirical evidence until today. Because it's hard to measure creativity, but we just think that Japanese Korean education somehow or not actually failed to educate the creativity. So I think we have to really ask some questions. Do we really have evidence? How do we actually measure creativity compared across country? The fundamental question is, are learning and memorization necessary antithetical to creativity? Yes. Okay, I will take the position that Japanese and Korean education probably, and actually, emphasizes learning and memorization. But does it really necessarily harm? It harms actually it harms actually creativity of students. So I think that's kind of the open question from my perspective. Again, because we don't have a measure for this creativity, it's hard to actually answer the question. But interestingly enough, in PISA 2003, there's a new measure called the problem-solving skill. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that problem-solving skill is a creativity. It is another test, to be honest. But it is not school curriculum-based test. So you can tap a little bit about that independent thinking, if not creativity. For instance, this is an example of how the PISA measures the problem-solving skill. So, for instance, there's adults and dormitories, and the number of beds, and you want to assign students and parents into different dormitories based on this rule. Can you do that? This is hard actually to do. So it is more like an analytic skill, right, to be honest, right? It's not a creative per se, but it is problem-solving skill, right? It's not like you don't need calculus to answer this question. You don't need physics, right, to answer this question. It is about the analytic skill. They're probably not particularly based on the curriculum, school curriculum, but more like a general skill to solve the problem in real life. So if you think Japanese Korean kids are doing well on this test, do you think it can have at least question about the lack of creativity in them? Still not? I don't know. But so this is one of the problem-solving skills. So again, Korean, Japan, Finland kids are the number one and grade 2 in the average score. Problem-solving skill. And even if you really look at the distribution same way, I mean, Japan actually changed a little bit in the figure, but for Korea and US, it's exactly the same, that the bottom kids are much stronger in Korea than actually US kids. Oh, I think I'm running out of time, right? So I have to stop somewhere. So I have actually interesting, the answer to the question 3 too, but I'd rather just wrap up here with one interesting thing. The reason why I'm care for these things is about this educational reform in Japan and Korea since 2000. Because of this strong stereotype understanding of the system, both countries made a really important, significant educational reform since 2000. So they're more and more like American education system in Korea. Now they have ability grouping. Now they have all kinds of schools that you can choose from. So if you go to Korea now, it looks like American school. So what happened then after this change? Again, because I have only six years window, I can't say anything about this change. But here's a little glimpse about what happened. So this is the distribution of science score in 2000, okay, which before this education reform happened. What happened in 2003? When the education reform started, and this is another 2006. So what happened is among the 6 year, over the 6 year, again, this is very short window, and I'm not actually making it big out of this graph, but it gives us some glimpse though that what happened is, because after this education reform, the bottom of the Korean students start to struggle because of the increased between school tracking system and increased difference within school. So again, I think the real problem of Korean Japanese education nowadays is increased inequality in students' performance. Not only by the distribution, but also by family background. I have lots of information about that. So since the education reform started, Korean and Japanese education start struggling with this issue about increasing inequality. So I'm not saying that Japanese and Korean education has no problem. There are lots of problems, but probably we've been diagnosing in wrong things to talk about. Really what's really going on is how we really should think about how Japanese and Korean education systems start to collapse at the bottom of the distribution because after this educational reform. So that's how I like to actually close this the talk by again to emphasize that we have to really understand the structural feature of the education system that may explain this pattern, but these things only can be clear when we actually look at the distribution rather than average score. Thank you.
Thank you so much for really engaging and interesting conversation. We'll have to have you come back and answer questions
Right,
for
yes.
us.
Yeah.
But I want to raise questions in the room, and then we'll go to online. Rebecca first.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is kind of a big picture. Obviously, a lot of policymakers use a piece of data to
Right.
make education policy.
Right.
In the U.S., we really focus
Right.
a lot on it. So how would you propose educating policymakers who just take the raw data without looking at these nuances like education structure to make better decisions?
Yeah, no, that's a tough question, right? I mean, especially scholars always try to be really careful, and whenever they say, hey, caveat, this after you write the whole paper and in conclusion, but this is a limitation of the study. So we like to be careful, but in fact, when these results are used by the policymakers, especially in competition across country, they tend to focus on the rankings and average scores. And whenever they actually interested about this piece of results, the first thing they jump on is actually what's the ranking. Okay, well, my country is now what, third, fourth? But again, I think it's hard to not to use them because that's, I think, there was a focus. But maybe we have to somehow develop. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think about what is kind of a nice way to, really good way to present this complicated. So, because you don't want to actually present this complicated story as they complicate, but still, though, I mean, what is kind of message? So maybe I actually want to actually emphasize that we actually really look at the different location of the student. So in other words, instead of really looking at the average score, we have to really look at how the students are kind of dispersed. Although this is probably more complicated than simple average score, so that's something that we have to work hard to come up with. But again, I think maybe some countries do better at the top rather than bottom, but some countries do actually bottom rather than top. So if we actually have this kind of nuanced actually comparison, I think probably we can learn actually more than simply looking at the average score. But how do they actually interpret that? That's a kind of whole lot different question.
Yeah. I have one more question.
Yes.
I'm very interested in this, that students are randomly assigned
Right.
to high schools, which obviously is super different from Philadelphia.
Right.
How did parents react to that?
No, exactly. That's a really good question. So Nowadays, so this policy was actually abolished in a few years ago, even Seoul, because of this growing concern about and growing complaint from parents about this, the school choice and education competition. I want to have my kids have opportunity to even get exposed to, the Excel, the curriculum. So in fact, there's lots of criticisms even within the South Korean context. But it has been kept for a long time, at least in Seoul, South captures for time. But when this, the new government came in with very conservative and liberal, the regimes, so they eventually get lead of this whole system because of this growing concern for the school choice, and along with all other change in liberal change in South Korea, like a labor union start to collapse, then all kind of, hiring process, they now become more individualized. So I think this is a whole, the package change in South Korea, and education was one of the example of how they want to actually move to more neoliberal kind of, the regimes, so that they increase the choice and individualization. But obviously, it has a consequence for, this growing inequality from my perspective.
So I taught in Japan for 2 years,
Okay.
and so I saw some of because I was in the teacher's room, I saw
Right.
this teacher rotation thing
I
happen. And in Japan, one of the things that I learned was after 3 years, the teacher might get moved to another school, or at the discretion of the administration, they might stay.
Right.
And one thing I noticed was that when we got teachers coming to our school from higher performing schools, because they were very clearly ranked, those teachers were miserable at our school, because we were a mid-level school. And so I'm wondering if in Korea, is there a similar situation now where, since the schools are different again, if a teacher gets rotated from a higher school to a lower school and they're a highly qualified teacher, is there an effect on them that may affect their performance?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I don't know much about the teachers' the kind of issues. So whether, to what extent, where to, even if they rotate, they cannot be rotated, they cannot move to a different province, right? You have family here, but then you ask to move to the 1,000 miles away from here. It's hard to do that. So they actually have some petitions, and there's some way of actually they wanted to be assigned to a certain area rather than moving really far away. And also, but I really don't know how this many play. And I'm sure that even though it is supposed to be like a random to some extent, but I'm sure that there's lots of factors kicking here so that someone actually get probably better play. But in terms of this high performing and low performing schools rotation, I'm not sure about whether there's any systematic pattern of that. In other words, do people want to move more move from high to low, or vice versa, and how does it affect their performance as a teacher? So that's kind of open question. I actually, to be honest, I am not quite sure. But in fact, that's kind of interesting, the system, right? So that the government tried to promote these high qualified teachers to move to even rural area sometimes, or the kind of remote area, so that they get some point, so that later, in terms of teacher careers, they can go up to high rank than the regular teacher, because they actually earn the point because they were assigned to these rural and remote area. So that's some young the teacher who have high kind of expectation, high career goal, intentionally actually sometimes take that kind of option. So I think there's lots of way to attract those teachers into those kind of the area, so that the students can get exposed to this high qualified teacher. So I think that's a pretty interesting system, which we don't know much about how it works, and how the teachers react, and how actually, even parent perspective, hey, this teacher was great for 5 years, why do they have to move, but they have to move, what does that mean, right? In the United States, we tend to believe that longer durations, tenure is always good, but in fact, may not be. So I think that's kind of a very interesting question to be asked in these situations.
Yes, Jennifer. I had a question about, parental behaviors. So, for example, in the U.S., we read a lot of literature, like Sean Reardon has written about how higher income families, parents are spending a lot of resources investing in their children with the idea of keeping them on the top, right? So they invest high in the early years so they're in accelerated math and they get identified as gifted, etc. Right? So Do we see that in sort of playing out in the context now that there are more
Right.
sort of choices
Right.
for
Exactly. No,
schools?
that's a wonderful question because it actually lead me to answer the number question 3 a little bit. The reason why Korea, I mean, at least for Korea, has lots of high private tutoring is because I think it's not just because Korean public schools are bad, but actually, on the other hand, I think it's because Korean public schools are too great. In a sense that parents cannot influence the schooling process. Like in the United States, you point out that some parents even talk to their teachers so that they put their kids in gift program, or hey, I have some evidence from other, gathering from private company, and it is you who messed up with my kids, not my kids particularly problematic, so then why don't you put my kids into gift program or some, the advanced classroom. But in fact, in South Korea, because of this highly controlled and highly standardized education system, parents can actually influence the schooling process per se. Then alternatively, what they can do is actually they can purchase private, right? They can buy out this private tutoring outside of school. So in other words, because of this institutionalization of public schooling, the parents cannot influence the schooling per se, but they can rely on something else, which is a private market. So that I think this is something that we can think about the other way, flip the coin. It's not because public schools are bad, so the parents are taking private market, but because the public school system in South Korea is so transparent and actually have no room for middle class parents to influence, so that they can rely on something else, which is actually private market. So I think that's how I would actually see these regions why Korea actually has lots of actually private tutoring. It's because one thing I can quickly show.
But are low-income parents also investing in them? So is it like on sort of both ends of the income distribution?
So I mean, this obviously you have to pay, so there's much less likely to be involved in those kind of. I mean, on average, yes, lots of Korean kids are involved in private tutoring, but even within Korea, there is actually like an income gradient, so that these the low access kids are less likely to involve in private tutoring. And in fact, it's high. The effect of the private tutoring also is mostly coming from the high top kid in South Korea. In other words, the private tutoring may actually benefit more for these top kids rather than bottom kids. But we saw that the reason why Korean education does better than other countries is because bottom kids are doing well, which less likely to be involved in private tutoring. So it's not a story about private tutoring, but it is something about the public schooling. And as you can see that actually lots of students in other countries actually be involved in extra lesson. It's not all Korea. Yes, in generally Korea is show large percentages, about 70%, but there's several countries, even more students, like Egypt, Armenia. I mean, see that lots of kids involved in extra tutoring here. So then why only Korea? Why the reasons why Korean kids are doing well is attribute this private tutoring, right? Even Japan in these years, here. It's actually kind of low side rather than high side. So I think there's a lot of myths about this private tutoring as well.
We have 2 questions online, and then we'll probably have to close, but I'll invite those in the room to stay on and have more informal conversation. The first question comes from John Gould, who wanted to know a little bit more about what a poor student looks like in Korea. And then the second question comes from Bruce Levine, who asks, how has the relatively better performance of poor kids in Korea translated into their ability to get into post-secondary institutions or to find employment after school?
Oh, I see. Okay, that's a very good question. So I just defined the poor students at the bottom, 25% of SES, the socioeconomic status of family, across these 4 or 5 countries. So in fact, the group of the poor students in my figures are the comparable across country. In other words, sometimes you can think about, hey, poor country in Korea may not be poor as poor country in the United States, right? Because of large difference in income inequality in this country than in Korea. So in order to prevent that, I actually make the students very similar in terms of their family socioeconomic status across the country. So these poor students are very similar in their socioeconomic condition. Although there are more American students who belong to that category than actually the Japanese and Korean kids. But in that sense, actually, those belong to this poor students from Japan and Korea are actually probably more selective compared to other group of the poor students in the United States, because they're really minorities in South Korea and Japanese. So it is not because, again, the reason why these poor students in Japan and Korea do better than poor students in America is not because poor students in America are actually poorer than actually poor students in Japan and Korea. In these particular figures, they are very similar in terms of socioeconomic status. The second question about their transition to the post-secondary, yeah, I know there's been growing gap there too. I mean, there's no systematic study yet, but because of nowadays more and more middle class just find out to support these students, their children's the academic performance through the private tutorings and all kind of the extra learning. So I think but college entrance exam is based on this test score, so that there must be a very big gap between these poor and affluent students in South Korea, and that becomes a more and more actual issue in South Korean context.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody who's face-to-face and online. I want to invite everyone back next month, the third Tuesday, for our next discussion on gender, masculinity, and Islamic education experiences here in the US. And for anyone who's a member of the Global in Education SIG of the Comparative International Education Society, we have an afternoon presentation starting at 2. You can look for it online on methods and methodology in global context. Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us today.